sort of plunge into interdisciplinary projects. Jed Perl will talk about Calder's project for the Teatro dell'Opera.
Thank you, Peter. Very grateful to the Academy and the Terra Foundation for making all this possible. Rome is not a city that anybody will immediately associate with Alexander Calder. Philadelphia, New York, Paris, yes, but Rome, not really. And yet it was here, in the Rome Opera House in March 1968, that Calder, who was 69 years old at the time, you see Calder on the right on the stage of the Rome Opera House during the preparations for this great adventure he took part in, or he created. It was here in the Rome Opera House in March 1968 that Calder fulfilled a lifelong dream, creating a full-scale theatrical performance in which he controlled everything, every aspect of the production, the conception, the design, and the execution. And you see on the left a poster for what was a triple bill that evening, and I'll talk a little later very briefly, especially about Allez Hop, the third installment of this evening. I want to approach Work in Progress. Work in Progress is the title of Calder's 19-minute experiment. I want to approach it from four angles in the brief time I have. I need to talk, first of all, about Calder's lifelong interest, you might even say obsession with the theater, which is why this experiment in 1968 is so important for him. I want to talk briefly about his connections with Italy. Then we'll look at Work in Progress itself. There are some fragmentary films of the production. And I'll conclude with some more general and really speculative reflections on the relationship between Calder's Work in Progress and Rome and Italy. Calder was besotted by the theater. Theater and theatricality were in his blood. When you think about the Mobile you see on the left is a work from 1940, a large plunging mobile called Eucalyptus. When you think about the Mobile, you realize the Mobile is a kind of marionette, a kind of shadow puppet, and I'm showing it here with a shadow puppet that was used in a performance at the Four Cats Tavern in Barcelona around 1900 when Picasso was starting out there. So all of Calder's innovations in kinetic art are in some deep and profound way connected with the theater. And indeed, the theater was something that was in his blood from the very beginning. On the left, you have an enormous fountain from the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco by Calder's father, the sculptor Alexander Sterling Calder, who was a very well-known figure in America from the teens to the early 1930s. Calder's father, who studied in Philadelphia, had thought of being an actor when he was young. Calder's father was besotted with the theater. Calder and his older sister Peggy were taken by their parents. Calder's mother was a painter. They were taken to premieres of George Bernard Shaw plays in New York. Calder's father took them to early O'Neill productions. And Calder, our Calder, years later, reflecting on his father's works such as the Fountain of Energy, said that his father's best work had a fantastic and flamboyant quality, in other words, a kind of theatrical quality. Briefly, in 1924, this is while Calder, he's 26 at the time, he's still studying at the Art Students League in New York. He worked as a stagehand at the Provincetown Players in Greenwich Village. You see on the right a scene with this dramatic chiaroscuro lighting from a play by O'Neill, the SS Glencam, which was designed, this stage picture was designed by a man named Cleon Throckmorton, who Calder worked for at the Provincetown Players in 24. Calder was actually a stagehand on this play. And Throckmorton, who's a rather large figure in early 20th century theater in America, is always talked about in terms of his dramatic chiaroscuro and shadow play. And of course, shadow play was something that fascinated Calder throughout his life. You all, of course, know about the circus that Calder began developing in Paris in 1926. The circus is a miniaturized version of a gigantic theatrical enterprise. And it became, in the late 20s, in the early 30s, really Calder's calling card to avant-garde Paris, and then the international avant-garde in Paris. Jean Cocteau, who will make a very brief appearance at the end of my remarks, saw the circus in 26, was very excited by it. Mondrian came to a performance of the circus in the early 30s, which precipitated Calder's encounter with Mondrian's studio, which moved Calder into abstraction. Calder, from the late 20s on, never said no to an opportunity to work in the theater. He worked with Martha Graham several times in the 30s, around the time Noguchi was starting to work with Martha Graham. In 1936, he was invited by the composer Virgil Thomson, who he'd probably also known in Paris, to do the setting for a production of Eric Satie's chamber opera Socrate, about the death of Socrates, which was put on at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, a hotbed of avant-garde experimentation in America in the 30s. On the left, you have a sketch done actually after the production about the set. And on the right, we have no photographs of the 36 production, but this is a 1977 reconstruction of this very somber, minimalist setting of what was a very somber chamber opera. And Virgil Thomson, no slouch as a student of the theater, said many years later that Calder's setting for Socrate remains in memory one of our century's major achievements in stage investiture. Now, Calder is in Paris beginning in 26 and into the early 30s, in the years when Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, and after Diaghilev dies in 29, the various inheritors of the Ballet Russe tradition, is an enormous force in the visual arts. Diaghilev had this dream, which he derived from Wagner, of a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, a work in the theater where artists, painters, sculptors, writers, dancers, singers, composers would all join together. Calder desperately wanted to do something like this, which he only got to do finally in 1968 in Rome. His good friend Miro in 1932 did sets for Leonard Massene's Jeu d'Enfant, children's play. Calder was in conversations with Massene in the early 30s about working with Massene. We think that Calder actually told Massene at this point that he wanted to do a ballet, what he called a ballet without dancers, and this somehow never worked out. There are fragmentary correspondence. On the left, you see Miro's model for the set for Jeu d'Enfant, and on the right, you see a work by Calder from 1934, Black Frame, which is about yay high, which is one of many works that Calder did in the 30s, which are standing picture/bas-relief sculptures, often kinetic. In the case of this work, these elements, the sphere, the red sphere, the yellow disc, and the white spiral all move originally with a motor. You see, in the 30s, Calder is dreaming up these sculptures, which are, in a sense, miniaturized stage pictures, staged performances. He writes in a letter on the right to his good friend James Johnson Sweeney, who organized the Calder retrospective at the Modern in 43, and then it's actually James Johnson Sweeney who organized the Calder show at the Venice Biennale in 52, which was Calder represented the U.S. at the Biennale in 52 and won the grand prize. And in this letter, you can see that Calder talks about his wish to make a sort of ballet of mind. And on the left is another kinetic work, again from 38, called Dancers and Sphere. By the late 30s and the 40s, partly because of the war years, there was a kind of slowdown in the possibilities, the potential for large-scale experimental works of all kinds, and Calder's sort of theatrical interests go underground for a while. In the late 40s, back in Paris, Calder is in America during the war, back in Paris right after the war. He actually does sets for a play by a friend, Henri Pichette, a young writer, called Nuclea, which is more notable for the stars than for the sets. The lovers in Nuclea were played by the intellectual heartthrob Gerard Philippe and a very young Jean Moreau, and the play was something of a sensation. In the early 50s, a Venezuelan friend, an architect friend named Carlos Villanueva, comes to Calder. Villanueva is designing an enormous new university in Caracas, and he comes to Calder as he goes to various artists, Leger, Arp, and a whole Vassarelli, and a whole bevy of young Venezuelan artists do murals and sculptures for the new university in Caracas. But he comes to Calder and says, would you do a sculpture or a stable or something to go either in front of the auditorium or in the lobby? And Calder says, no, I want to be in the theater. And Calder creates what is the acoustical ceiling for this theater. Again, this whole dream of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the artist getting actually into the theater. And Calder said for the rest of his life, he died in 1976, that this is one of the works he was proudest of. So you have him with this longing to do something in the theater where he can really control everything that's happening. And then we shift to Italy. Now, Calder's life relations to Italy are nothing like his relations to France. He spends, when you add up all the time, a third or more of his life is spent in France. The last 25 or so years of his life, he spends much more time in France than in the United States, mostly in a village called Sachet in the Touraine. But he's a presence there from the time that Peggy Guggenheim's collection is shown in Venice. He had been a little bit in Rome in the 30s. His wife, Louise, had an aunt who lived in Rome. In 1952, as I mentioned, he wins the grand prize at the Venice Biennale. Interestingly enough, by the time the show opens, he is not in Venice anymore. He actually hears about the prize when he's in Putney, Vermont, visiting his older daughter at school. In 56, he has a show at the Galleria dell'Obelisco here in Rome, and there he meets a man known to many of you, Giovanni Carandente, the curator and critic. And they make an immediate bond. I mean, most of the things that happen in Calder's life are fueled by passionate friendships, and he and Carandente become very close friends. He tries to get Carandente to actually buy a house in France, but Carandente, who's also very involved in Spoleto, says he'd have to sell his house in Spoleto if he buys a house in the Touraine. He doesn't. This is, on the right, a 1967 wire portrait of Carandente by Calder. Calder did very few wire portraits after the 1930s, but for special friends, every once in a while he would do one. This is in the wire portraits in the museum, the Carandente Museum in Spoleto. Carandente, some of you probably know, organized an early Mondrian show here in Rome. He wrote a pioneering book about the great Sicilian Baroque sculptor Serpata. And if you think about this, both the interest in Mondrian's constructivism on the one hand and the kind of fantastical Baroque of Serpata on the other hand, you could see why he would have bonded with Calder, who really combines those two kinds of things. It's Carandente who invites Calder in 1962, when Carandente organizes the big international sculpture show in Spoleto, to design what is really the first of the big stables that Calder does, called Tea dell'Appio, which is set up, as many of you know, outside the train station in Spoleto. Carandente said that what they wanted was a sort of triumphal arch at the entrance of the city. And it is Carandente who introduces Calder to Massimo Bogiancino, then the director of the Rome Opera House, a man who had a career here and then ended up as the first director of the Bastille Opera in Paris, where he was involved in the legendary production of Berlioz's Trojans, which was part of the revival of interest in Berlioz late in the last century. And Bogiancino was interested in modern opera. He, in the same 67-68 season that you have the Calder work in progress. They mounted Stravinsky's Rake's Progress, Alban Berg's Lulu. Boccancino said, design sets for a ballet for us. And Calder's response was, well, actually, what I want to do is design a theatrical event completely myself. And Boccancino said, fine. Now, let's think for just a second about what we're talking about. We're talking about 1967, 1968 happenings. The Living Theater is presenting Paradise Now with audience participation in both Europe and America. There's a kind of defreezing of theatrical experimentation. In a sense, a lot of the openness about theater that Calder had first seen in the 20s and 30s in Europe is kind of reviving. And so at this moment, this man in Rome says, sure, do it. They have all kinds of discussions about what the music should be. First, there's talk about using Vivaldi or Scarlatti. Calder doesn't want to use something. He decides Baroque. Calder knows Pierre Boulez. He gets in touch with Boulez. Boulez has nothing that's the right length. Calder is then given a record done in Rome earlier in the 60s called Electron 3 of neo-avant-garde electronic Italian music. And works by Bruno Maderna, Nicola Castiglione, and Aldo Clementi are then used as the sound for this evening. Calder in late '67 does little maquettes which are brought to Rome. The sets which still exist, I should say, on the right you have Calder, his wife Luisa, and Carandente in the Rome Opera House during rehearsals. On the left you have Calder in Carandente's apartment here in Rome. These little models were brought there. They were made into stage works with using canvas and wood for a lot of the elements that Calder, either working in his own studio or working in one of the large ironworks, either in France or America where he did bigger things, these things would of course been metal. The sets still do exist. They're in the possession of the Rome Opera House. And then Calder came back in late February of '68 to work it out on stage. He decided to call it Work in Progress, obviously a salute to his old, somebody he'd known in Paris, to Joyce's Work in Progress. He'd known Joyce a little bit in Paris. And remember, when Calder's in Paris in the 30s, Work in Progress is, Joyce's Work in Progress is this mysterious, evolving creation that everybody in Paris is sort of very aware of. So I think he liked that idea of something where people didn't quite know where it was going. On some of the, there are many, many sketches and drawings for the various elements, objects that ended up being on stage. And on one drawing, there are a couple of little notations. Calder writes, "At last I have a chance. Go it alone." And I can't be sure, but to me, these seem very significant, because here's this man who has been dreaming since the early 1930s about doing something like this, and here he is. He's 69 years old, and he's finally getting a chance to do it. At last I have a chance. When they were in rehearsals, he said to Carandente, "You know, I really should have called this My Life in 19 Minutes." Now, what Work in Progress is, and as I said, there are these fragmentary films, not of the complete thing, but partial films. I'm going to show you some stills that give you a sense of a couple of the episodes. I'm not doing it in order because we really don't have anything in color of some of the early episodes, but I'll show you those in a minute. But what you had were 8 or 10 vignettes or tableaux vivants, you might say, with a curtain coming down in between them. And taken together, I think they do grapple with some rather large ideas. Calder was a man who did grapple with big ideas, philosophic, even metaphysical ideas. But he presented them in a kind of what-the-hell way, with a kind of gosh, oh, shucks, ease. That was Calder's way. And he didn't like to get into heavy metaphysical talk about things. But Work in Progress, I do believe, is about becoming, evolving, evolution, and the act of creation. The mobile, to begin with in the early 30s, was grounded in the idea of taking the stillness of sculpture and sending it into motion. And I think there's always, in a sense, a Pygmalion idea about the mobile. The mobile is, you take something inanimate and you bring it to life. And I think for Calder, what work in progress was about was taking these mobiles, which he'd given life, and setting them on stage and letting them become the actors, finally, in their own drama. So you have these scenes where these mobiles and standing mobiles on the stage and then mobiles above would simply revolve doing their thing. One of the marvelous qualities of work in progress is the use of stagehands. And there's a memorable scene where you have 8 stagehands in black rising out of the floor as a wire drops from the ceiling, and then they come up carrying a mobile, which they then attach to the wire. They let the mobile take off, have its own free life, and then they depart. Okay? And I think, again, this is about the role of the creator, who makes something, homo faber, the man who makes, creates, and then leaves. And clearly there's an idea of Asian theater here. Many kinds of Asian theater have these sort of stagehands who are on stage. Bunraku puppet theater in Japan, they're sort of there but not there. And it also, I think, is a memory of the circus, Calder's great first love. This is a circus tent being set up. But when you think about the circus is a lot about getting it set up, getting the trapezes in place, getting everything ready. All these people get things ready for that moment of kind of artistic magic. And indeed, Calder's own circus, if you've seen films of it, a lot of it is about Calder himself making the things happen. That's as much what the story is as the things themselves. Work in progress actually had a kind of Genesis element, because it began with this image of this kind of charming, almost penny theater vision of the ocean with odd sea creatures tumbling across. There was also seen with birds. On the left are Calder's sketches for the birds, which I'm showing with, on the right, a study by Calder's good friend Leger for the Swedish ballet's Creation of the World, which was done in 1923, before Calder was in Paris. But I think Calder may have been aware of his friend Leger's work on this ballet Creation of the World when he was thinking about these early creation scenes. There are also scenes in work in progress when earlier kinds of Calder work. On the right you have a Calder work from 1936, and on the left a still. Many of these are by Hugo Mulas, by the way, the stills. You have on the left a still from the production, and there were moments when would be brought on stage a work from the 30s, or a replica of a work from the 30s, a work from the 40s. So he's also reflecting on his own evolution as an artist. There's then a scene, a fabulous scene, where a whole fleet of guys on bicycles ride onto stage and do figure eights and circles. And they're in these crazy costumes, which Calder, these are sketches by Calder on the left for the costumes. I'm showing them with again, a sketch by his friend Leger for a costume for skating rink, again, a mid-1920s Swedish ballet. And that was the kind of thing that Calder had yearned to do. And the cycle scene is also, in a hidden way, highly autobiographical. Because Calder, in his youth, in Montparnasse, was known as the guy who rode everywhere on his bicycle. The Herald Tribune at one point reported on Calder, just back from Berlin, on his pet bicycle, adorned in the habitual sailor trousers and orange socks. And you can go further with this, because there is a whole connection in early modernism between the bicycle and the speed of the bicycle and a revolution in art. Alfred Jarry published in 1897 a novel called Days and Nights. And the hero of Days and Nights is a man named Sengel, who rides everywhere on his bicycle. And Jarry writes, he should he should use this machine with gears to whisk up forms and colors as fast as possible with a rapid suction as he whirls along roads and bicycle tracks. And after this assimilation, the mind can far more easily recreate its own forms and colors. So I think the speed, Calder's own speed on the bicycle was part of, I think, one of the things that precipitated his great taste for kinetic art. At the close of Work in Progress, there's this marvelous sun, some mobiles above, and then a pyramid appears. And then at the top of the pyramid appears a man who waves a flag. And here I think we have a sharp contrast that interests Calder between the stability of the pyramid. This pyramid is a very stable shape, and of course also immediately evokes, when seen like this, the pyramids of ancient Egypt. And then on top of that, the freedom of movement of the flag. Calder said in many occasions that disparity was the key concept in his work. And here you have the disparity between stability and freedom, the intransigence of the pyramid, the transitory nature of the waving flag. As it happened, the opening of Work in Progress in March of 68 was overwhelmed by the third element on the program. The first element was a rather conventional one-act opera by Francesco Malapiero, but the closing number was this Alle Hop, Let's Go, with a libretto by Italo Calvino, music by Luciano Berio, a pile of TV sets on stage, apparently fleas let out into the audience. I can't quite know if I believe the newspaper accounts. And then what the newspapers described as shaggy-haired, bare-chested male ballet dancers who attacked the opening night Roman audience with pots of paints and paintbrushes, threatening to paint the elegant first-nighters' clothes with paint. One newspaper had a headline, ballets invade the opera house. So in a way, Calder's Work in Progress did not receive all the attention it deserved. It actually had more of a success when it was done 10 years later, right after Calder's death in '76. It was revived on an interesting 4-part bill at the Rome Opera House with 2 ballets that went back to the time of the Ballet Russe and Diaghilev, and a 4th work, which was a collaboration of Beckett, Samuel Beckett, Morton Feldman, with sets by Michelangelo Pistoletto. And it has remained really a kind of phantom, in a way, in the Calder oeuvre, in the body of work. I'd just like to conclude very briefly with some general thoughts about the eruption of Work in Progress in Rome, the city to which Calder did not really have close ties. One of the things that immediately comes to my mind when I think about all of this is a very famous remark. Some of you, I'm sure many of you know it. The Englishman John Evelyn in Rome in 1644 saw a theatrical performance by Bernini, and that masterminded by Bernini. And he wrote, Bernini painted the scenes, cut the statues, invented the engines, composed the music, writ the comedy, and built the theater all himself. And I'm just showing you Work in Progress to the right with an engraving from 1650 of the Piazza Navona with the Festival of the Resurrection in progress. This is at the moment when Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers is up. And I've come to feel that there are certain things that we look at in the past that we can not necessarily precisely explain, but we have a sense that there's something in the weather of a place or something in the DNA, or there are certain convergences that we maybe can't completely identify, but they're there anyway. And when I think about this idea of Bernini kind of doing everything, and then you think about the relationship between Rome and the circus, and Italy and the circus, and the ancient Romans and the circus, and Calder's infatuation with the circus. The fact that this happens in Rome is perhaps not completely accidental. And that, of course, leads one to think about some of the great modern theatrical events that didn't necessarily premiere in Rome, but gestated here. And it is, of course, in 1917 that Picasso, in the middle there with his wife-to-be Olga, and to his left, Cocteau, and Leonid Messine, choreographer who Calder wanted to work with 15 years later, they come to Rome, where the Ballet Russe is, to contemplate Parade, one of the great early modernist circus things. And there's, and again, it's sort of Parade, which is completely Parisian in many ways, music by Satie. It somehow gets part of its impulse from the time that they spend in Rome. Finally, at the very same moment, under the auspices of Diaghilev, at the building that is now the Rome Opera House, it had a different name in 1917, Balla does sets for fireworks, music by Stravinsky, a ballet without dancers 50 years earlier, in which colored lights played over these Balla designs. We have nothing but these sketches now. And did Calder, was he aware of Balla's designs? I mean, when you look at the pyramid in the Balla, was he aware when he did his pyramid that something like this, not unlike it, had been done 50 years before? I mean, Carandente mentions the Balla in things he wrote at the time about work in progress. So Calder knew something about it. The whole relationship between Calder and Futurism is a very mysterious thing we'll probably never have answers to. But again, something in the DNA of this theater, okay, despite all the productions of Verdi and Tosca and all that, something in the DNA of this theater somehow made this possible, I think. And so it was in Rome, a city to which Calder did not really have deep connections, that he finally, in March 1968, fulfilled what had really been almost a 40-year dream to create a ballet without dancers. Thank you very much.